Mick Taylor, Why Talent Alone Fails, Part 1. Quote, I always had an instinct and a feeling from very early on that I would be a successful guitar player, if nothing else. Rock critic Robert Christgau has a theory. Between one-hit wonders and major recording acts, there are beautiful losers who are a rock tradition that goes all the way back, heroic failed album artists. Artists may be artisans, with half an hour in them, rather than 3 minutes. They are a legacy of the days of expanded consciousness that flourished in the era of corporate rock. The worthwhile LP that neither portends the ripening of a long and honourable career, nor sells diddly squat, is more of a feature of the 70s than the 60s. The Solitary Stone. Does it matter that no member of the Rolling Stones has had a solo career of note, but 3 of the Beatles did? No. If it were that easy, surely Mick Jagger would have managed it by now. This podcast is about the Stone who dared to be the first to leave the band, and not in a pine box, as Keith Richards demands of his bandmates' exits. If Keith keeps the scores on the doors, it's 3 in coffins and 2 warm bodies leaving by their own volition. One of those is Mick Taylor. He departed in 1974 in the middle of a Christmas party in a huff about songwriting credits, a lack of touring, and there being more snow-white powder inside the studio than on the winter streets of Munich. In 1979, he released his self-titled debut album. It's a charming record with first-rate musicianship. The story of how Taylor came to make it and its aftermath leaves a lingering sense that he missed his chance to forge a solo career. It's not a rollercoaster ride. This is not a blockbuster tale. This is a reverse meta-narrative, if you will. One of many narratives that clue us into rock music in the late 70s. It's about somebody finding out who they really are, and what it is they really want. What are they prepared to do or not to do in order to reach their goal? Mick Taylor loved the music more than he loved the game, the fame, and the drugs that he came to depend on for nearly 20 years. Taylor is not a casualty of the Rolling Stones' sinister allure. He got out just in time, but had to come to terms with his own musical journey. The 70s. Pop music not only grew commercially bigger during the 70s, but also became more fractured and varied. However, it seemed to lose cultural impact. The pronouncements from rock stars didn't carry the same weight as they had in the 60s. Perhaps, as former Rolling Stone critic John Landau says, this had been a role foisted on them. In the 70s, as subgenres proliferated and the money made from selling music doubled, the overriding sense was that the music and its makers were there simply to entertain us. The relationship between audience and musicians changed. Renowned music critic Nick Kent saw the roots of this change in the rise of glam rock stars like Mark Bolan and David Bowie. In the 60s, musicians had an egalitarian attitude towards their fans. For them, both parties were on an equal footing. The ascent of glam was characterized by Bowie and Bolan behaving as superstars while treating their fans as slaves. Kent noted glam rock concerts in 1971 were the first public manifestation of the 70s me-decade consciousness in action. The kids wanted vanity instead of virtuosity, and Bolan was ideally suited to spearhead the change until Bowie stole his audience the following year. This is probably another consequence of the Rolling Stones' diabolical folly, the Ultimates Festival of 1969. Standing on a low platform barely above the audience at the base of a muddy amphitheatre with 300,000 terrified, drunk and tripping fans, the band cowered as the Hells Angels unleashed their fury on whomever they felt disrespected them. There was an atmosphere of violence, Taylor recalled, of the most ominous night of his first tour with the Stones. He witnessed Meredith Hunter's murder a few meters away from where he was playing their 1966 pop hit, Under My Thumb. After Altamont, concert stages got higher, separating fans from rock's precious princelings. In Nick Kent's eyes, Bowie and Bolan took particular pleasure in looking down from their perches at the hysteria they caused in the clamouring young hordes below. Tellingly, while with the Stones, and indeed beforehand, Taylor was not a rock musician with a profile as either an entertainer or an activist on any social issue. A damning assessment of him was made by novelist Truman Capote, who was tasked with writing a travelogue of the Stones' 72 US tour. With the rancour and charm of a rancid little toad, Capote said, "The Stones are complete idiots. Mick Taylor is pretty, a little Jean Harlow blonde type, but dumb, and totally uninteresting." Summing up, Capote pronounced, "Intuition tells me they'll never tour this country again, and in fact will not exist in 3 years. They are not important." Taylor would arrive at a similar, if less acidic judgment at the end of 1974, but I'm getting too far ahead of myself. I'm off. The most sensational moments in Mick Taylor's public life were his entry into and mysterious exit from the Rolling Stones. The reason for the first was straightforward enough, if tragic: the death of rock icon Brian Jones. The cause of the latter has been the basis of dark rumour and speculation for over half a century. As for the parties involved, both sides have shifted their explanations for what exactly led to Taylor walking out on the biggest band in the world in December 1974. Early on, Taylor blamed a lack of musical progression and creativity, with hints about a worsening drug culture within the band. In 2009, he clarified, "Towards the end of my period with the Stones, it got very laborious and monotonous. There were a lot of people around the Stones that seemed to drag them down and hold them back. Certain people's addictions to drugs didn't help." It led him to conclude, "There are a lot of reasons I quit. I never actually regretted quitting them." However, anecdotes about the drug-crazed young guitarist recording drums, bass, and backing vocals on tracks circulated the music press for years. The story ran that the shy, mild-mannered vegetarian who had joined the Stones from the more purist John Mayall's Blues Breakers had been corrupted by the Stones machine. Taylor admitted that Jagger had proposed Taylor take time off to get his drug issues under control, but he had spurned the offer. By 1974, I felt I'd gone as far as I could with the band. I didn't think that they'd stay together. The records were doing well, but the band was falling apart. It was in chaos. Mick Jagger tried to persuade me to stay, but I told him I was fed up, and that my drug problems were beginning to worry me. Mick suggested taking 6 months off, but I've never been very good at taking advice. Maybe I should have listened. For his part, Jagger hinted over the years that Taylor had left the Stones due to a rift with Keith Richards and had wanted to launch a solo career. In 1995, the Stones frontman seemed to remember his namesake's time in the band favourably, but backhandedly rehashed Capote's words when he said the lead guitarist was a very fluent melodic player and that Taylor would play very fluid lines against my vocals. He was exciting, and he was very pretty, and he gave me something to follow, to bang off. Some people think that's the best version of the band that existed. As usual, Keith Richards refused to sing along to Jagger's tune. In his 2010 autobiography Life, he was effusive in his praise for Taylor's playing. Keith remarked, "Sometimes I was in awe of Taylor's playing. His melodic touch, a beautiful sustain, and a way of reading a song. But there was a personality mismatch with the young virtuoso. This disconnect between technical ability and a quiet personality would characterize Taylor's difficult relationship not only with Keith Richards, but with fame." In a keen, if sour recognition, Keith said the younger man was shy to the point of being very distant. Shortly after, legendary engineer Glyn Johns, who worked extensively with the Stones during Taylor's tenure, published his memoir Soundman in 2014. In it, he provided a critical first-hand assessment. During the 1971 Exile on Main Street sessions at Villa Nelcote in France and the mixing at Basing Street Studios in London, Johns witnessed Taylor's deterioration, as told to Mojo in 2015. He turned from being a quiet, softly spoken, charming young man into a raving, egomaniac junkie. Not everyone agrees with this portrait of Taylor and his time with the Stones. Producer Jimmy Miller who guided the band through their golden era, offered a telling theory about why Taylor's solo career was unlikely, suggesting that Taylor had been stifled by the Stones because they wanted him to fill that necessary part of the Stones. He added a dimension that Keith wasn't comfortable with. I think Keith had a very different vision than Taylor and wanted to protect his songs. For some, it may be comforting to simply hold Mick Jagger and Keith Richards responsible for bad outcomes that may actually be more complex. Because of how music was made in the 1970s, and how different people working together may face very different challenges. I'm gutted that Brian Jones died tragically, and that Mick Taylor's life seemed to go off the rails during his time in and after the Stones. But it wasn't just about what the Glimmer Twins did. There are broader influences playing out in Taylor's musical career, which create a far more intriguing story than the common blame the players not the game narrative. I don't subscribe to the view that Mick and Keith were jealous or merely greedy. This ultimately doesn't really explain what happened to my satisfaction. I'm also conscious that no one else has devoted this much time and attention to Mick Taylor's debut album in the last 47 years. The Boy from Hatfield. How do we get a sense of a man and his talents? From his words and actions? Or what others say about him? Or through the times he lived in? One of the 20th century's more ridiculous fascinations was the focus paid to young men who plucked, hit, or blew into musical instruments. Their youth when achieving fame and the endless scrutiny of their personal lives means that we know far more about Frank, Charlie and Diz, Elvis, John and Paul, and Mick and Keith than we know about some members of our families. Mick Taylor is the polar opposite of this type of musician. Born in Welwyn Garden City in London's commuter belt, from what we know, Taylor grew up in a stable family home in Hatfield and developed an early interest in music. Talking about his parents, he says half-jokingly, "They always encouraged me to be a professional musician because I think they realised I wasn't very good at anything else." We know though, from a photo he has posted online, showing him and his teammates holding a trophy, that he also liked to play football and was quite good at it. In another photo, he's holding a guitar. In both he looks calmly and reservedly at the camera. There is a sense that a lot is going on inside him, but he's not sharing more than is required. You couldn't find a better description of him as he made his first steps into music in his mid-teens. Taylor takes to the stage. Mick Taylor's life changed when, barely 17 years old, he turned up to watch his hero Eric Clapton play with John Mayall on Monday the 18th of April 1966 at Woodall Community Centre in Welwyn. Since the age of 15, he had gone up to London to watch visiting blues and R&B artists at venues like the Flamingo. He was familiar with Mayall's repertoire. By his own words, he was very excited and equally nervous before the start of the show. But as on several occasions that spring, Clapton failed to show up. It was soon clear that he would not accompany his waiting Gibson Les Paul Standard on the stage. During the break, Taylor sought out Mayall and persuaded him to let him sit in with the band during the second set. At the end, he gave his phone number to Mayall and melted into the crowd to rejoin his friends. As shy and retiring as he was, Taylor mustered up the courage to persuade Britain's leading blues band leader to allow him to play Eric Clapton's Les Paul. Yet afterwards, rather than staying behind to receive any of the adulation or using the opportunity to launch his career on the back of more than adequately covering for the best guitarist in Britain, Taylor seemed to disappear for over a year. Mayall would remember him a year later when he was looking for a replacement for Peter Green. But there was always the possibility another higher profile guitarist could still have snagged the job, as we'll see. In this musical origin story lies the mystery of Mick Taylor. It will come to define the destiny of Mick Taylor the album, and his life thereafter. After sitting in for the man nicknamed God, Taylor joined a band called The Gods, who toured in southern England in 1966 and early 67, before releasing a cover of Every Mother's Son's Come On Down to My Boat Baby in June 1967. It failed to make any significant waves in British music circles, and this version of the band broke up. This seemed to typify Taylor's fortunes in the music industry at the time. On the Stones' 1973 tour of Australia, he explained, "I formed various bands which broke up after 2 or 3 months because of financial reasons." 9 days after Taylor's departure from the Gods, in June 1967, John Mayall put a musician's wanted ad in Melody Maker, a weekly music paper, as he had lost Mick Taylor's phone number. Luckily, Taylor spotted the advert and contacted him. He then turned up for an audition at Mayall's flat without a guitar. Playing a male loner, watched by Marsha Hunt, soon to be mother to Mick Jagger's first child, Taylor won the coveted spot. He played his opening gig with John Mayall at the Fishmongers Arms in Wood Green, North London, on the 20th of June 1967. In 1969, as he was about to leave Mayall's band, he remembered the experience as being the most daunting of his young life. "I've never been as nervous in my life because I was following in the footsteps of Eric Clapton and Peter Green. It was 18 months before I found my feet and would improvise more and more and play different things every night." Mayall, a scholarly and visionary blues band leader, provided Mick Taylor with a platform to explore and express his gifts on the guitar. Mayall and his acolytes toured incessantly across the UK, Europe and the United States. Mick Taylor had the chance to appear and play with some of the greatest guitarists of the blues rock era, Albert King, Jimi Hendrix, and the 2 guitarists he had replaced in the Blues Breakers, Peter Green and Eric Clapton. During Taylor's 2 years with Mayall, they recorded several highly successful albums, including Crusade, Blues from Laurel Canyon, and culminating in the highest charting Blues Breakers album, Bear Wise, which peaked at number 3 in the UK chart. Those albums also contained several tracks co-written by Mayall and Taylor. It was a hint that the young guitar virtuoso was developing into a top-rank musician. Taylor spoke warmly of his time with Mayall before his departure to the Stones. "Playing the sort of music John plays, it gives you a lot of opportunities to develop your own ideas. It gives you a lot of freedom within the blues framework. It did me a lot of good being with John." When the Stones came knocking in the spring of 1969, Mayall did not get in the way and put Taylor in touch with Mick Jagger. At the age of 20, Mick Taylor was invited to work with the Rolling Stones in the studio. At first, he says he thought this was as a session guitarist. Having successfully worked over a couple of days on what would be the Exile on Main Street album track, Loving Cup, and the Stones' next single, Honky Tonk Women, Taylor was invited to join the band full-time. Right from the start, the chemistry between Taylor and Richards was startlingly good, and clearly a source of pride for the guitar specialist. "I thought the way me and Keith Richards played was very special." At the time he left John Mayall in 1969, Mick Taylor had a breadth of guitar playing experience second to none. He was a seasoned blues rock guitarist with a few songwriting credits. His compositions, while not departing from British blues patterns, demonstrate Taylor's mastery of the blues rock genre, and his pieces were well received by audiences and critics. Yet surprisingly, it was neither superstar status nor musical quality that convinced Taylor to join a big-time outfit like the Rolling Stones. "I never saw it, the Stones, as a lifetime thing. No, never," he told VH1 in 1997. Instead, he saw it as a temporary arrangement. "I didn't look too far into the future. I saw it as a great opportunity to make some money and have some fun." Becoming a Stone. When Taylor joined the Stones, he unwittingly entered into a psychodrama that would define his time in the band. Taylor was the anti-Brian Jones. He was an excellent musician who could always be counted on to deliver live on stage, and whose personality did not threaten to rival Jagger or Richards. Brian's life, in its staggering extremes, had been the meaning behind the band's ethos and significance. Once he was canonized by a tragic and befitting death under the dark, tantalizing spectre of drugs, murder, and decadence, Mick and Keith were freed from their cursed muse. They hoped the music would flow without Brian. For a while it did. They drank at the drying well of their fallen comrade's memory in songs like Shine a Light and Sway. It's noteworthy that on both songs Keith Richards is missing entirely. On Shine a Light, a song started by Jagger sometime in 1968, he reflects on Brian Jones's worsening condition. At the time of its release in 1972, the song was equally applicable to Richards' drug-induced state. The guitar and bass performances, all Taylor's, radically eschew the band's usual approach. There's no singular riff, but rather a gospel-inspired guitar solo from start to finish by Taylor. It's a weirdly heartfelt epitaph to Brian and Keith. The misgivings Jagger observed in the song about Richards' hangers-on were echoed by Taylor in 2009 when explaining the reasons for his departure in 1974. Ian Stewart, the heart, soul and conscience of the band, lamented that Keith's drug problem was turning him into a walking bloody tragedy, a terrible waste of talent. The lyrics from Shine a Light are illuminating. When you're drunk in the alley, baby, with your clothes all torn, and your late night friends leave you in the cold grey dawn, just seem too many flies on you. I just can't brush them off. At the same time, the usually restrained Charlie Watts called the Taylor period a creative peak, and a tremendous jump in musical credibility. Shine a Light is a clear example of the Stones' greater musical credibility during their golden period. Unfortunately, the musical excellence wasn't to last. As the band faltered, Taylor's sense of involvement waned. The sophistication he brought to the band isolated him commercially and psychologically. As Jimmy Miller observed, this particularly felt threatening to Keith Richards' vision of the Stones. 4 years after Brian's death, the group whose music had led them to be hailed as the greatest rock and roll band in the world were phoning in songs and albums with an unappetizingly reduced ambition. The epic scale was gone. Now it was only rock and roll. This collapse in the potency of the bad boys of rock would incite a generational response with the rise of punk, and even a protest song in the Arrows' I Love Rock and Roll, which became Joan Jett's signature song. By the early 80s, the only way the Stones would top the chart was as a reference in other people's songs protesting their lack of meaning. For Taylor, the writing was on the wall well before the mid-1970s. On the 1973 Stones tour, a journalist asked him, "Do the Stones give you all the musical outlets you'd like to have?" His response was somewhat prophetic. "No. There's lots of other things I'd like to do with other people, and I will do, when I get the opportunity." In 1974, when Keith Richards nixed a proposed tour in support of the album It's Only Rock and Roll, Taylor felt his contributions to the band were being unnecessarily wasted. "My role as a lead guitarist has always been very satisfying, especially live on stage, which is where I feel I make my greatest contribution towards the group." Taylor's stellar contribution on 1974's Time Waits for No One, on his last album with the Stones, and his extended funky bass part in Fingerprint File could not disguise the diminution in the Stones' work since 1969. The gods of Olympus were falling. Taylor, their golden-haired messenger, left before he went down in flames with them. Why did he leave? I challenge back, why would he have stayed? That's of course separate from what he needed to do to establish himself as a solo artist. Sticky and exiled. Taylor's time with the Stones resulted in incredible highs and lows. In his own words, being in the Stones was both heaven and hell, a roller coaster ride. The successes are well documented. From his earliest thrilling introduction to the press on the 13th of June 1969, to his first tour across America, the horror of Altamont, and the recording of the Stones' masterpiece Sticky Fingers, for which he worked successfully with Mick Jagger on crucial album tracks and contributed to the hits Brown Sugar and Wild Horses. His impact was immediate and raised the bar in the instrumental interplay behind Jagger. After 1971, starting with Exile on Main Street, Taylor was trusted to write with Jagger and able to fill in on bass when Richards and Wyman erratically missed sessions. As he pointed out in 1997, a lot of that had to do with Mick and Keith not really working together as songwriters. The song still said Jagger Richards, but they weren't really written like that. Some of the songs I helped write. Let's put it this way: Sway, Moonlight Mile, Can't You Hear Me Knocking, Shine a Light, Ventilator Blues, Winter, Till the Next Goodbye, and Time Waits for No One would not exist if it wasn't for Mick Taylor. The more one thinks about it, the more the Jimmy Miller theory rings true in at least partly explaining Taylor's limited role in the Stones and the frustration this eventually caused him. Rather than just being an egomaniac as Glyn Johns portrays it, Taylor was trying to grow as a musician, and Mick and Keith weren't having it. Unlike John Mayall, they weren't supportive of his musical development. The humiliation of being ordered out of Basing Street Studios by Jagger in 1972 when he clashed with Johns was just one of several incidents, as was Keith deleting Taylor's guitar parts in Munich in 1974. When Richards finally refused to tour the following year, Taylor lost patience, feeling hopeless about his future in terms of the band. To better understand what most see as the pivotal decision in his career, walking out of the Stones, it's worth taking a closer look at the darkness and despair the guitarist encountered between 1972 and 1974. Nick Kent, the famed NME journalist, whose 1974 interview with Taylor would be the guitarist's last as a Stone, wrote, "The Stones were sinking more and more into the dark vortex they'd unleashed at the dawning of the decade." Backstage, prior to a show in Manchester in 1973, Kent observed, "When the five members were together in the same space, the conversational repartee between them was usually strained and hesitant. The source of their discomfort wasn't hard to locate. They were each at their personal wits' end about how to coexist harmoniously with Keith Richards, whose ongoing drug addiction continued to daily imperil their potential to work." Jagger refused to judge or move against Richards, in a sign that some lessons had been learned following Brian Jones' sacking and death. However, the lead singer cum business manager spent the best part of the decade finding increasingly ingenious ways of extracting the band and Richards from peril. One such dicey scenario occurred when customs officials discovered large amounts of Class A and B drugs and amplifiers which were being transported across Europe. Jagger managed to negotiate the Stones out of many similar misadventures in the mid-70s before Richards' luck ran out in Toronto, Canada in 1977. As Richards later admitted, "I was running on fumes." Living as if strapped to a ticking time bomb while risking to lose himself in the twilight of rock's wasted glamour eventually seemed too much of a folly to Mick Taylor. However, fortune did not favour him. Leaving the Stones and the advice of engineer Andy Johns to join up with the combustible bassist Jack Bruce was literally a case of jumping out of the frying pan and into the fire. What is notable is that just like before with John Mayall's Bruce Breakers, when recruited into the Stones in 1969, Taylor joined a band with a structure that had been established and proven successful. He was able to provide his musically sophisticated lead guitar playing in a stable band setup. He was never the cause of a group success or a founder of a band leading it to success. However, it's worth going back to Jagger's comments in 1995. I think he, Mick Taylor, had a big contribution. He made it very musical. Then when assessing Taylor's years, Jagger almost put his foot in it when he said, "Some people think that's the best version of a band that existed." It's safe to say most, not just some fans, do. That's a dead giveaway. Despite not actually giving Taylor the song credits he probably deserved, Jagger couldn't help but acknowledge the quality of the contribution the guitarist made during the Stones' greatest period. It would be better if Jagger spent more time doing right than talking up Taylor's contributions. It's a shame that Jagger didn't feel enough shame to correct the quantity of songwriting credits on the tracks he worked most closely on with Mick Taylor. In recent years, the Stones have restored writing credits to Robert Johnson, Marianne Faithfull, and The Verve. Jagger has even discussed donating Stones royalties to charitable causes on his death. If Jagger and Richards are in a charitable mood, then I have a suggestion. Charity begins by righting past wrongs. Start with Mick Taylor. But so far, they have not seen fit to do right by their bandmate, who helped elevate their music to its pinnacle. In the end, this leaves a sour taste in the mouth and will always leave Jagger and Richards open to accusations of being no better than glam's rock stars, high in their perches and even higher on their egos. Or as the great broadcaster Alistair Cook wrote about the Stones, among others, "The fans are the distorting mirrors in which the stars see their images, blown up beyond any human scale. The victims of this ceaseless adoration, more often than is pleasant to see, wallow in the ocean of their narcissism and accept it as no more than the due of their uncanny beauty or talent. That was Mick Taylor, Why Talent Alone Fails, Part 1, by RolloGuitar, published by Tosha on Patreon. The essay, references and photographs for this podcast will be available on our Patreon page, RolloGuitar. The next episode, Mick Taylor, Why Talent Alone Fails, Part 2, will be exclusively available to free and paying members, also on our Patreon page.